What's going on, y'all? KMBest here, your favorite 69th ranked Marvel Snapper. Let's talk about the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. And despite all the noise about Star-Lord, an undeniably powerful deck, I have Shou-Lao Batroc at the top of the rankings this week. Now, to be clear, I think there's sort of a triumvirate at the top. Batroc, Shou-Lao, and Star-Lord make up the elite tier of decks, but they all come with some downsides, and they're all relatively difficult to play, so other decks can overtake them if you aren't actually going to put in all the time to get to the intricacies of these lists. Now, Batroc Shou-Lao is actually a fairly difficult deck to play. A lot of this deck is about understanding your relative position in a metagame. This is sort of the deck that sits on top of all the other mid-range decks and says, I have enough combo stuff in me that I have more points than you, but you still need to allocate those points wisely. And I think that's the thing most people struggle with when they play a list like this. This is the list that Iris, who's been like either 1 or 2 or 3 for the last month or so, has been playing. It's pretty consistently been a top performer at the high end of Infinite. And if you put the time in to master the list, I highly expect that you will be rewarded for it. Batroc without Shou-Lao is a good enough deck on its own to be one of the best decks in the game, and in fact is actually better than this list at targeting Star-Lord. If you're interested in that, stick around till we talk about that list. But what this list does is beat basically everything else, and it's not even all that dead into various combo matchups. Thanks to being a fairly competent Cosmo deck that is going to take priority, you will at least have a puncher's chance a lot of the time. The Shou-Lao Maverick combo has combined itself with the best synergy scaling package in the game. It should be no surprise that this list comes in at number 1. Now let's talk about the more hard-targeted version. If you see a bunch of Star-Lord, this version is going to be better. You are giving up some top-end power, that Shou-Lao bit where you sit on top of every other deck, but you still have the incredible scaling of the Batroc package, and this time it's backed up by more disruption and better targeting for that disruption. When you're trying to beat Star-Lord, what you do is you target their turn 5. Their turn 4 may be a Star-Lord. They have 8 energy on turn 5, but they're not going to have priority. So what you do is you disrupt and set up for a turn 6 that you are going to win. Ideally, the way you do this is by preventing them from copying the Star-Lord, which is what they're going to try to do. You make that not happen, like Cosmo their Zola, for example, and their turn 6 is very normal, and the deck doesn't win if they don't have a million energy on turn 6. This is also just a deck that has a lot of powerful interactive tools that can cover a lot of spots. Like, you're just going to get a lot out of being a good deck that has Daredevil, Cosmo, Negasonic wrapped into it. Batroc is the glue here. That package is what makes this deck work as well as it does, and I think it is not being respected enough as one of the true pillars of this metagame. Here is where I'm at for stock Star-Lord, give or take an Echo for the Sunspot. I know Roram has made that switch, and I think largely this is an example of the Star-Lord deck sort of scaling down now that it doesn't have to deal with as many mirrors. If you're worried about mirrors, either Juggernaut or Legion could become a Red Hulk. Between Juggernaut, Legion, and the other things that you're doing, what this deck is really setting up to do is have the biggest BS detector in the entire game. What this deck does is check every other deck that's doing something ridiculous, whether that be through Eliathing a bunch of lanes, playing a Legion to get rid of their Limbo. This is the deck that is sitting on top of combo decks. And what it's trying to do right now is minimize the amount it is able to invest, or the amount it has to invest in deck building to still beat all of the mid-range decks while also trying to deal with those combo decks. I think it has successfully gotten to a point where I feel like most of the time, if both of us are playing a combo deck, I'm going to be favored here. But if you want to win the mirrors, the Red Hulk can come back in, and if you want to tech against the people teching for you with things like Cosmo, the Echo can come in. The Sunspot really isn't all that great. Like, it's fine. It's not like the greatest thing on earth. It's just like a fine thing. So that's a very easy swap for the Echo if you want to make that change. If you want to go even further, the Honifer build of Star-Lord is as anti-meta metagamed as you can possibly get. This is a deck that is extremely built to deal with specific threats. We're both Star-Lording. I have a Mercury and a cannonball that I can drop on your Star-Lord and blow your stuff up, right? You're playing Jean Grey, I've got a Wasp. You're playing Cosmo, I've got an Echo. This deck is about specificity. It's one of the most teched out and hyper specialized decks in the metagame, and it's also in the hands of a player who I think is really good. If I recall correctly, at the time of recording, Honifer is ranked 3, basically playing a lot of this list, and it is a deck that is able to sort of bully snap a lot of the mid-rangey stuff. The fundamental advantage Star-Lord has is that when you have your draw, you're going to be doing things that are probably stronger than your opponent, and it's on them to counter you. So the harder you make that, the more guaranteed the snap is. This is the deck that is trying to make it as hard as possible to deal with the Star-Lord. There's usually just a lot of solutions for what your opponent is doing in this list. Doom 2099 is in such an odd position. Sometimes I have to go based off of my instincts, and sometimes I have to go based off of the stats. And the stats on this deck get better the lower ranked you are, which I think is probably relevant information. This is a deck that the worse your MMR is, the better it's going to do because it's very simple and doesn't ask anything of you. One of the things that I am continually surprised by is which decks get worse in lower ranks. Shou-Lao decks have consistently gotten worse in lower ranks. Batroc decks have gotten worse in lower ranks. Star-Lord decks, relatively static, but maybe a little bit worse. Doom 2099 gets better. And I bring this up to say that a lot of the time, one of the best things you can do for you as a player is to pick an easy deck so you don't have to focus on what your opponent is doing, or you don't have to focus on what you're doing, and you can only focus on what your opponent is doing. This is how you take the mental load off of yourself and start learning things outside of your own experience. And for that reason, I think Doom 2099 is a really solid choice. I think that it is a deck that if I had to give it like a serious stack ranking, I would bet that it is unfavored against Star-Lord. It doesn't really have answers to when they fully combo off, but they do probably need a Fin Fang Foom to beat you, and so you are able to play real games against you. It is in range against Batroc stuff, but unfavored against Shou stuff because the Shou combo will usually go over the top of what you are able to do if they're doing things. That's sort of how I see this, but it's very in range of all of those things. None of those matchups are that bad. They're just like not ideal, but they're not horrendous. And then you kind of stomp all over a lot of things that are just trying to like play points. You're especially good against the decks that are hard targeting Star-Lord. Things like Super Giant, you are just absolutely running over. But generally, this is a deck that takes the mental load off of you, has some good matchups in the metagame, and has some bad matchups in the metagame, but none of the bad matchups are so truly atrocious as to make it unplayable, and it just sort of consistently outputs points in a pretty reasonable way. Now, downsides, a lot of that consistent output is dependent on the card Doom 2099 existing. That's not always going to happen, and it does give you a little bit more of a combo deck profile than you would like. But this is still a deck that has some really reasonable power, and crucially, is one of the easiest decks in the game to play. That means that it's probably a good recommendation for a lot of people. When I played Magic the Gathering, I played the easiest decks possible. The deck I hit rank 1 with on MTG Arena was mono red. This was to reduce the amount of chances I had to mess something up. That is a very valid strategy for climbing. Supergiant is a safe choice, an extremely safe choice. It just does a lot of work. It has a couple of good matchups. It's able to slow down most decks in the format. It's probably the easiest anti-Star-Lord deck you could come up with. A lot of your matchups against Star-Lord tend to come down to like, what did they play face down? Is that an Arnim Zola? Like for a couple weeks, you were pretty easily able to get away with it on the Star-Lord side by face downing an Arnim Zola, which they would then try to Negasonic. I think they're mostly wise to that play line now, so it makes things a little bit more complicated now that they are like, oh, well, you know, I'm probably just going to Cosmo that. So then you now need like an Arnim Zola and a 1-drop if you want to be doing that because you're probably going to have 8 energy on turn 5. That's how it works. And that way, at least you're 50-50ing it. The point here is basically that this deck has the tools to drag everyone down to its level and beat them with experience. There is nothing special about this deck. This is the deck that is controlling your opponent's output as best as anything in this metagame does. If anything is the Sarah control of this metagame, it is this list. Stop your opponents from doing whatever it is they're going to do. If you didn't stop them, the thing they're doing is probably better than the thing you're doing. You are playing, other than your control tools, a very 2023 deck here. This is just numbers. So if you're not dragging your opponent down into the mud with you, you are probably not winning. Another deck with a similar ethos is Aurora. The idea here is just have a bunch of answers to a bunch of stuff. Your opponent is playing Arnim Zola on their Star-Lord? No, they're not. They're getting Stardust. Your opponent is playing something that loses to Cosmo? No, they're not. They're getting Cosmoed. And then the rest of the deck is just solid point output with Aurora. You have Thing First Steps as a sort of weird out to stuff. Like, Thing First Steps is quite good against Cerebro things, for example. You're just often able to use him as like a get out of jail free card or like a wide ranging anti card. But largely, this is a deck that is going to be defined by what it can and can't answer. Doom 2099, if you have your Stardust, you're great into that deck. You guys are doing the same thing, but you're better at it and their Doom bots don't spawn. Star-Lord, again, if they're able to use Grandmaster and, say, an Absorbing Man instead of a Zola, well, they're probably going to beat you. But you have a Cosmo, you have a Stardust, you are alive in that matchup. The things you really want to worry about are, like, the move deck. Like, I've tried a Mercury in here just because the Batroc deck is really tough to beat otherwise. And generally speaking, it's just like, okay, anything that's like scaling points better than you, that's the dangerous stuff. That said, this deck does points fairly efficiently. There's real numbers that get real output here. It just really needs Aurora in order to actually do those points. Star-Lord Mr. Negative is a fairly reasonable deck, in large part because it just gives Mr. Negative an additional thing to do. The biggest problem with Mr. Negative has never been the output is too small. It has almost always been it's just simply not consistent enough. And Star-Lord in this deck is not Mr. Negative 2. He's like half of an additional Mr. Negative. But the thing is, you still have all the output. So you're going to take that half of a Mr. Negative, and you're going to say, thank you very much for giving me half of a Mr. Negative. The other thing this deck gets to do that a lot of other decks aren't really good at doing right now is be a Killmonger and Shang-Chi deck. Those are very valuable things to do. Like, Killmonger is extremely good against Batroc, very, very powerful in that matchup. There are a lot of decks that have at least a few one-drops that you're going to hit, and a lot of decks that are just playing really big guys all of the time. And being a Shang-Chi deck is very valuable in that context. So there's a couple of things going for this deck. The first is that Star-Lord is helping it be a better Mr. Negative deck. And the second is that it's one of the few decks that can really afford to be a Killmonger Shang-Chi deck in the current metagame. This gives it a fairly solid piece of positioning. This is a deck that is going to do some reasonable work. It's a very solid list. Now, it can brick really hard, but I think when you saw Mr. Negative in the deck, you kind of assumed that that was a potential thing that could happen. Definitely possible, even likely, I would say. But this is still a deck that does points very well when the combo happens. You have a half of a Mr. Negative in Star-Lord, and you can win games off of Star-Lord into Null Shang-Chi, right? Like, that can win you some games fairly reasonably as well. It's not the end of the world when you are forced to be a Star-Lord deck. I've also seen some Grandmasters in this list, investing more heavily in the Star-Lord list, bit, allowing you to do like Shang-Chi on multiple lanes. I'm not sure what I would cut to make that happen, but it is the kind of thing you can do. Now, normally, I think you might be expecting the tier list to end right about now. Like, he's talking about Destroy this early in the tier list. I gotta tell you, I've been playing a lot of this specific build of Destroy. I felt like one of the stupidest people alive when, after playing this list with Honifer for like 3 hours, neither of us came up with we should put Maverick in the Shou-Lao list. Turns out, if you put Maverick in the Shou-Lao list, it's quite good. this deck actually just works. I had a very reasonable climb on it. It feels a little bit analogous to the Batroc list, where it's just the 10 cards in this deck that are doing the normal thing that this deck does. And then also we have Maverick Shou-Lao. We're playing a billion one-drops. We just get like 9 to 12 points on the Shou-Lao, double them with the Maverick, and that can beat a lot of decks, right? And when you have this many one-drops, there's also additional synergies. Like there's an Agony in here that can go on your Maverick. There's Head Pool. Those buffs can go on your Maverick and on your Agony. There's just kind of a lot of things that actually work here. Like in the optimal case, you are a version of the Batroc list, except you have Killmonger, which beats their Batroc, and you scale higher. They are more consistent, but you have a higher high roll, right? And that's just a really reasonable deck right now. That's a extremely reasonable profile for a deck to have. I think this deck is actually just pretty good. Like, I think this is legitimately an alternative, maybe slightly worse compared to the Batroc list, but it is sort of in the conversation at the very least. It's felt very good for me. It's felt very good for Gamer. It's felt very good for Honifer. It's felt very good for Cougar. These are all players who are routinely in like the top 100, top 50. This is just like a bunch of people who've been messing around with this specific list. The one card I'm not particularly certain on is Moira X. There are a couple options here. I tried Grandmaster. I thought it was notably worse because of the way one-drops weave into your curve, but Moira can clog your hand. Another suggestion was America Chavez. Not sure about that, but I can see it. And a final suggestion that I think if you're seeing a lot of Star-Lord might be a good idea is Uncle Ben. Moving their Star-Lord deals with a shocking amount of the things that allow that card to get copied, namely Arnim Zola and Grandmaster specifically. That's two of the three things they're mostly going to be targeting with the Star-Lord with. So, like, you can actually do some stuff with a Spider-Man coming out of the Uncle Ben on those games. On the subject of decks you can kind of just jam Shou-Lao in, Bounce is just a really solid way to output points. This is Doc Guapo's Bounce list. He's been playing something similar to this in like Top 50 Infinite for like a month now. And it's just finally gotten to the point where enough people are countering Star-Lord that this kind of just, here's my point output, is kind of what the metagame is becoming about. Like, here's my points output, and it's definitely not all on turn 5, and I'm able to hide from some of the interactive tools that people are playing, and this deck is able to really do that. But you are going to have to get a couple of things, or keep a couple of things in mind when it comes to this list, because you really don't want to be stranding a card in hand. And the cards that are most often in conflict here are Shou-Lao and Sasquatch. So make sure you play in a way that is allowing you to get the Sasquatch on the board. This means please remember to do things like Beast on 4 so you can play a bunch of ones and Falcon them on 5 to make sure that this guy gets as cheap as he can. So if you draw Shou-Lao, you're not leaving 10 power in your hand, or even just playing him earlier. That can work too. Just make sure you don't get married to, I'm going to do it all in the final turn of the game, and then you end up with, like, cards you can't play. Like, this is a deck that is going to be Shou-Laoing stuff, right? So make sure you're doing your output into the Shou-Lao, and your hand on the final turn of the game isn't, like, 3 1-drops, 2-cost Sasquatch, and then a Shou-Lao. Because if it ends up like that, you have wasted a lot of potential power. Now, this is still a deck that, much like Destroy, is benefiting from the massive amount of 1-drops that it runs. Very often, it'll just have 12 to 15 power Shou-Laos, and that is a good enough reason for you to play this list as is. Shou-Lao remains a metagame staple. My pick for most underrated deck in the game is still Cerebro 3, but it is a deck that requires a lot of intestinal fortitude in order to choose to queue it up. Because this deck, if every location was ruins, probably beats 70% of the meta most of the time. Like, this is a deck that I would expect to have a massive win rate if every location was ruins. Unfortunately, locations have text, and sometimes that text really jacks you up. That is ultimately the thing that holds Cerebro back, and it's the thing that has always held Cerebro back. In a sort of mental battle where locations don't factor into it, this is a deck that is just good into so many things right now. It has the Daredevil Cosmo ready to deal with the Star-Lord multiplication. It has so many points that even a Shou-Lao deck has to think twice before thinking it can go over the top of it. It has a massive amount of interactivity and power, but fundamentally it has every weakness that any Cerebro deck has ever had. 1, it's hard, and 2, locations will get you. And that means that you have to be incredibly disciplined when you play a deck like this. This is a deck that you need to be on top of your snaps and retreats, because otherwise you will end up throwing value away. A couple of Fantomex lists. I feel like these are a bit of a super hyper metagamed kind of thing, where if you're not seeing a lot of Star-Lord, these are very reasonable choices for you to make. But I think that between Star-Lord and all the Cosmo stuff, you are very often forced to play like option 2 a lot of the time. When you play this deck, if you think your opponent is likely to have Cosmo, that's a real problem, and you need to like spread out your payoff guys. Like you'll play a Marrow in one lane, and then you'll play a Hood in another lane, right? Kind of have to do things like that because they're gonna Cosmo the main lane. Like it just is going to happen. And that kind of thing is really relevant here, as opposed to like the Destroy Shou-Lao deck, which has Killmonger as a meaningful out. This deck doesn't have cross-map destroys, effectively. And so if they Cosmo, like, your things, those things are Cosmoed, and that is really bad for you. The upside here, though, is the points output is quite nice. This is a deck that does points fairly efficiently and fairly well. One play I really want to highlight is summoning Dormammu on 5 in order to use it to blow up an Airwalker. That play is a particularly good way to get a Fantomex onto the board and activated, so make sure you're pumping those spells as much as you can. In order to do that, that means you have to play the first spell on 3, which you are very often capable of. And remember that a lot of the time when you leave something alone at a location, you're like, I have to split up my targets for blowing things up. Well, you can always go make that play on that location. Let's say they Cosmo the Hood lane. Okay, well, you go to your Marrow lane. Your turn 5 is going to be, let's blow up the Marrow and the Airwalker with the Dormammu spell, right? Like that kind of thing, using Dormammu as like a link piece rather than the end game, is, I think, something people miss about this list. Big Baby has been a Fantomex truther for the last few weeks and has pushed towards the top 10 with this list for the Fantomex and a separate, but I think a little bit more awkward, Prodigy Jocasta Fantomex list. Both of these lists are doing the same thing, which is, here's just a bunch of power. I refuse to interact outside of Gambit, and that is going to have to be enough. There's just a lot of gambling in a list like this, but the power output is extremely real. You can do things like, Mind Stone Gambit, right? Off the Infinity Ultron. That's also pretty real. There's a lot of removal of what your opponent is capable of doing in this list to go alongside the output. It's definitely not a list, and there are very few lists, of which the following is true, that can stay against a Star-Lord, but it's the kind of list that can, 50-50 a Gambit to blow that Star-Lord up before they can start copying it and win that way, right? There's stuff in here. Another thing that this deck can do against Star-Lord is Cosmic Ghost Rider the Star-Lord. You're probably going to have priority, so just Cosmic Ghost Rider the Star-Lord, they're not copying anything, and then they lose. This kind of just mid-rangey thing with just a plan into a lot of things that you're going to see is a very, very solid choice to make. The points output is here. The interaction for Star-Lord is here. The numbers are here. There's plenty you can do in this metagame. I've also seen some Star-Lord Phoenix Force running around. This feels to me like it's just Star-Lord but worse, but what it does get to do is really cool fire hair stuff, and there's really nothing bad I can say about that. It's just the kind of deck that is sort of optimizing for having 40 energy and not as much for winning when you have 40 energy. But there's a lot of cool stuff that this deck can do. There's a ton of interesting and dynamic things, but fundamentally what you're doing is getting a billion Star-Lord procs, reviving something and blowing something up, right? Like that's a lot of what this is. A billion Star-Lord procs. So I play Firehair, and then I play Star-Lord, and then I Venom the Star-Lord, and it's like, whoa! There's also versions of this deck that run like Arnim Zola instead of the Misery, so you can Zola the Star-Lord instead of Miserying the Star-Lord. You get what's going on here. It's just an alternate method towards duplicating Star-Lords, and there's some upside here. Like, it gets around Alioth with the skills. I think that's like a reasonable thing to at least be trying to build for. There's versions of this that run like Galactus type stuff as well, hybridizations, just generally a kind of interesting new development in the field of competitive Star-Lording, which is a crowded field. Last up, taking the spot of Destroy, is Rorum's Kraghead build. This is a Galactus build that is optimizing for turn 4 Galactuses. Now, what this deck is trying to do basically is use those turn 4 Galactuses to bully people out of the game, or failing that, make sure that they don't get 85 Star-Lords. If you get the Galactus down, you're probably gonna be okay. I've seen a couple of versions of this list, and I think that this is generally a reasonable thing to be doing. There's some interesting things in here, in as much as any Kraglin deck is ever going to be reasonable. I think this is likely the best you're gonna get at playing to his actual strengths and wanting to get those +2 energy. Again, a lot of this is just Galactus is quite good at punishing board-based combo. Star-Lord is board-based combo. Shou-Lao is board-based combo. You are able to Galactus them pretty freely, and that's just a good thing to do. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.